In the heart of a raging blizzard, she was barely standing, clutching something close to her chest, stumbling through the snow in search of shelter, until she stopped before the cabin of a man who had lived alone on the mountain for years. He hesitated for a long moment, then slowly opened the door. That night, he didn't know he was opening more than a door. He was letting grace and life itself back into a house that had known only wind and memory. Stay a little longer, pour yourself a cup of hot tea, and I'll tell you how one small act can change the course of an entire life. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next story about kindness and the quiet miracles that still bloom, even in the coldest winter. The wind that night didn't just howl, it hunted. It came tearing down the ridges of Colorado's high country like some wild creature with a grudge, clawing through the pines, rattling shutters, and filling every hollow with a sound that made the heart shrink back into itself. The snow fell sideways, not downward, whipped by gusts that turned the world to a blur of white and shadow. Even the river that wound past the foot of the mountain had vanished beneath ice and drifting fog. There was no light, no color, only the voice of winter, sharp as a blade and patient as death. Nathaniel Briggs stood on his porch beneath the hanging lantern, his breath rising in small clouds that froze before they faded. He was 42, tall and broad-shouldered from years of chopping wood and breaking trails through snow. His beard, streaked with frost, framed a face cut in hard lines, the kind of face that once belonged to a man who spoke often, but forgot how. His coat, thick buffalo hide, was worn smooth at the elbows, his hat brim bent from years of weather. Behind him, the cabin stood solid and silent, logs darkened by soot, windows shuttered tight against the wind. He had built it himself, nail by nail, season by season, and in its stillness he'd learned to live with ghosts. 3 winters alone had made him a part of the mountain, and the mountain asked for nothing in return. But that night, the silence began to move. At first it was only a blur in the distance, something shifting against the white. Nathaniel narrowed his eyes, thinking it a trick of snow or the shadow of a pine swaying in the gale. Yet the shape persisted. It swayed, stumbled, and rose again. He stepped forward, boots crunching into the drift. His pulse, slow for so long, began to stir. When the wind broke for half a breath, he heard it, a ragged sound that wasn't the storm. A voice? A cry? He couldn't tell. But it was human. Through the curtain of snow she appeared. A woman, thin, cloaked, half bent beneath the weight of the storm. Her shawl was stiff with frost, her skirts torn at the hem, boots caked with ice. Her face was pale as bone, lashes clumped with snowflakes, lips cracked from wind and fear. She clutched something close to her chest, wrapped in a blanket the color of ash. Her hair, dark and tangled, streamed from beneath her hood, and her breath came in short, desperate bursts. Each step looked like it might be her last, yet she kept going, driven by something that refused to die. Nathaniel's first thought was disbelief. No one should have been on that trail tonight. The nearest town was 15 miles through bad country, and even the wolves had taken cover. He stood frozen, watching her stagger toward the steps, until she reached the bottom one and nearly collapsed. Instinct pulled him forward before reason could speak. He caught her by the arm and felt how cold she was. She looked up at him then. Her eyes weren't pleading, nor afraid. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much, survived too long, and no longer had the strength to ask for mercy. Her voice was hoarse but steady. "If you want to send me back," she said, "you'll have to wait till spring. I ain't walking through that storm twice." Nathaniel said nothing. He'd never known what to do with words. They always seemed too small for the things that mattered. So instead, he did what he hadn't done for anyone in 3 years. He stepped aside, pushed the door open, and let the warmth of his fire spill into the night. The woman hesitated on the threshold, eyes flickering between the dark of the storm and the glow inside. For a heartbeat, the world hung still. Then she crossed it. Inside, the cabin breathed warmth. Firelight danced across the walls, painting the rough timbers gold and copper. The smell of pine pitch and smoke filled the air. Nathaniel took her cloak, heavy with snow, and hung it near the hearth. Beneath it, her dress was travel-stained and clung to her like wet paper. She leaned against the table, one hand on her belly, round and taut beneath the folds of fabric. Only then did he realize what she'd been holding. The blanket she clutched wasn't for warmth. It was a baby blanket, small, embroidered with faded blue thread, the kind a mother keeps close for comfort. He felt the old ache of memory stir in him, the one he thought he'd buried with the last winter he shared with someone. He turned away, busied himself stoking the fire, pretending not to see the tremor in her hands as she reached toward the heat. "Name's Nathaniel Briggs," he said finally, voice rough as gravel. She didn't look up. "Anna," she answered. "Just that. Nothing more." He nodded once. "You can rest there by the stove. There's stew on the shelf, bread's dry, but it'll do." She lowered herself slowly onto the chair, movements careful, protective of the life she carried. "You always feed strangers who wander through a blizzard." He met her gaze. "You're the first one to try." For a while, the only sound was the crack of wood and the storm outside, pressing its face against the walls. Nathaniel poured a cup of hot water and set it before her. Steam rose between them like a thin veil. She didn't thank him, just wrapped her fingers around the cup and closed her eyes, as if the warmth itself was prayer enough. He studied her quietly, the drawn lines around her mouth, the hollow of her cheeks, the stubborn angle of her chin. Not soft, not delicate, but enduring. There was something in her stillness that made the room feel less empty. The fire popped, sparks dancing upward, and for the first time in a long while, he wasn't aware of the clock ticking on the wall. Outside, the wind screamed against the eaves. Somewhere far off, a tree split with a sharp report. Nathaniel rose, latched the door tighter, and checked the rifle leaning by the hearth. Habit more than caution. When he turned back, Anna was already asleep, head resting against the chair back, one hand still curled over her belly. Her hair glowed in the firelight, a faint halo of copper and shadow. He stood there for a long moment, watching her breathe, feeling a strange unease stir in him. Not fear, but the kind of restlessness that comes when silence is no longer alone. The mountain had always belonged to the wind and him. Now there was something new in it. He was about to bank the fire when the door groaned on its hinges. A sudden gust burst through, scattering ash and snow across the floor. Nathaniel spun, cursing under his breath, and reached to close it, but then froze. In the lantern's glow, he saw them. Footprints. A second set. Smaller, lighter, trailing behind where the woman had come. They led up to the porch and stopped. The last print vanished beneath fresh snow, as though whatever had made it had been swallowed whole by the storm. Nathaniel stared into the white darkness beyond his door, listening, but the mountain said nothing. Only the wind answered, low and endless, whispering through the pines like a name he didn't yet know. Morning came slow and colorless, the kind of dawn that crept in quietly so as not to startle what had survived the night. The storm had passed, leaving behind a pale sky and drifts piled high against the cabin walls. The silence that followed was thick, heavy, almost alive, not empty, but watchful, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. Inside, the hearth still burned low, the air scented with pine smoke and damp wool. Nathaniel stirred the embers and added another log. The fire caught, throwing soft orange against the timbers. Behind him came the faint rustle of movement, not the creak of wood nor the sigh of wind, but the small, careful rhythm of another human being learning the space. Anna moved quietly, the way someone does when they've spent too long being unwanted. She took the kettle from its hook, filled it with snow from the bucket by the door, and set it to boil. Then she knelt by the hearth and scraped away the ash, her hands steady, her face calm but unreadable. There was no talk of thanks, no exchange of plans. She worked as if she belonged nowhere and everywhere at once. The fire brightened. The cabin, for years filled only with the echo of a single man's breathing, now carried a different sound, the whisper of cloth, the faint clink of metal, the sigh of water heating to steam. Nathaniel watched her from the doorway, one hand resting on the post, the other wrapped around his mug. His world had been a pattern of chores and ghosts. He'd memorized every creak of the floorboards, every whistle of the wind through the shutters. But now, that same silence had shape and texture, as though something fragile had taken root in it. When she turned toward him, their eyes met briefly, a look neither welcome nor refusal, merely acknowledgement. Then she asked, almost as if talking to herself, "How far's the town?" "Too far to matter," he said. She nodded and went back to her work. By afternoon, the sun broke through the thinning clouds. The air glittered with fine ice, and the pines stood tall and solemn, their branches burdened but beautiful. Nathaniel led Bramble, his dark Mustang, to the shed and brushed snow from its mane. The horse flicked its ears, exhaled clouds of steam, and looked toward the cabin where the faint smoke curled upward. It had been a long time since Nathaniel had seen smoke rise from that chimney, with a softness that didn't look like loneliness. He spent the day in the woods splitting logs, though his mind wasn't on the work. Each swing of the axe seemed to echo differently now, not emptier, but fuller. When he returned, Anna had laid a pot of stew on the table. It was thin, mostly broth, but warm. She sat opposite him, eating in silence. For the first time, the scraping of spoons on tin didn't feel like noise. It felt like proof that something still lived inside these walls. That night, the wind rose again, gentler this time, brushing along the windows like an old friend checking in. Nathaniel sat by the fire, whittling a small piece of wood into the shape of a sparrow. Across the room, Anna mended her shawl by candlelight. The only sounds were the fire's sigh and the steady rhythm of thread through fabric. He could feel the weight of her presence. Not heavy, not intrusive, just there, like warmth itself learning to stay. When he finally spoke, his voice startled even him. "You came far enough," she said without looking up. "Someone waiting for you?" She paused, needle frozen mid-air. "Not anymore." He nodded once, and that was the end of it. Words, he thought, were too small for certain kinds of sorrow. He rose, put another log on the fire, and went outside for a moment, breathing in the sharp air. The stars had returned, faint and tremulous above the peaks. When he came back in, she had fallen asleep in the chair, her hand resting on her belly, the repaired shawl draped loosely across her shoulders. Days passed like that, quiet, measured, as though the cabin itself was relearning how to breathe. Anna kept to simple tasks, boiling water, cleaning the hearth, mending old linens. She spoke little, ate little, but everything she did carried a kind of reverence, as if work itself was a prayer. Nathaniel began to leave the door unlatched during the day, trusting the calm that had settled between them. Even the mountains seemed gentler. The birds returned to the trees, and the wind no longer screamed but hummed low through the pines. One evening, while splitting wood inside by the fire to avoid the cold, Nathaniel heard something he couldn't mistake, a sound too human, too raw, a sob. Not loud, not dramatic, just one quick, broken sound that shattered the stillness like thin glass. He froze, axe in hand, then quietly set it down. He didn't knock on her door. Instead, he poured hot water into a cup, placed it on the small stool outside her room, and added another log to the fire. The flames rose higher, spilling gold across the floor, soft and forgiving. In the morning, when he woke, her shawl was folded neatly at the foot of her bed, freshly washed, dried by the fire. She was sitting at the table when he stepped out, hair loosely tied, face calmer, almost serene. "You didn't have to be kind," she said softly. eyes fixed on her hands. "I ain't kind," he replied. "Just decent." There was a small smile, barely there, before she turned back to her bowl of oatmeal. Outside, snow began to fall again, gentle, harmless, the kind that looked like forgiveness drifting from the sky. That night, as the fire died low and Nathaniel banked the coals, the cabin seemed unusually still. He blew out the lamp and was halfway to his bed when he noticed something on the small table beside the window. A book, cracked and weathered. One he didn't remember leaving there. Its spine, faded and worn, read The Prairie Woman's Guide to Birth. The corner of a page was marked, halfway through. He stood in the dim glow, looking at it for a long moment. Outside, the wind had softened into a lullaby. Inside, the cabin, for the first time in years, seemed to breathe. By mid-morning, the snow had stopped falling, leaving the world soft and strangely bright. The mountain seemed gentler now, its edges blurred by fog, the air heavy with the quiet that follows exhaustion. Smoke rose steady from the chimney, and the sound of an axe splitting wood carried faintly through the trees. The storm had ended outside, but inside the cabin, something else was stirring. A weather without wind or snow, but just as real. Anna was moving about the room, her hands sure and graceful, as though every motion was meant to prove she still existed. She scrubbed the kettle until it shone, folded blankets with careful precision, and mended a tear in Nathaniel's old coat by the window. The light caught her hair, turning it to copper for a heartbeat before fading again. She didn't hum or speak, but the rhythm of her work felt almost like prayer, a ritual to keep her mind from wandering to the places it shouldn't. Nathaniel watched from the porch, his breath curling in the cold air, the mug in his hand gone cold. He didn't know what he was waiting for. Maybe just the sound of something that wasn't silence. He'd never seen a person so still and yet so alive. The mountain had taught him the language of waiting, and now he found himself using it on her, watching the way she avoided mirrors, the way she always left a lamp burning a little longer than needed, as if afraid of the dark. When she looked at him, it wasn't distrust nor affection, but something between, a wary acceptance, as if both of them were trying to remember how to share space with another soul. That evening, the sky turned lavender, and the trees were blue shadows. Nathaniel sat by the hearth sharpening his knife, while Anna stirred the stew, the faint scent of thyme and onion filling the air. The light of the fire flickered over the rough beams, painting them in gold and crimson. For a long time there was no sound, but the fire breathing. Then, quietly, she spoke. "My husband died in a labor camp," she said, her voice calm, too calm, like a wound that had frozen before it could bleed. "Not in war. Over a sack of flour. He hit a guard who tried to touch me." Her hand paused on the spoon, her eyes distant. "They beat him to death for it." Nathaniel stopped sharpening. The fire popped, throwing sparks into the air like startled birds. He didn't look at her, only poured her a cup of water and set it beside her bowl. "They never let me see him," she whispered. "Just give me his ring in a napkin." The cup trembled slightly in her hand as she took it. The steam rose between them, curling upward and fading into the shadows. Nathaniel spoke at last, voice low and steady. "Stories like that, they got claws. Don't let go easily." For a moment, she seemed about to reply, but instead only nodded, eyes fixed on the dancing flames. The room fell into silence again, but it was a different kind this time. Not empty, but heavy with what had been said. Outside, the wind pressed softly against the windows, as though listening. Later that night, when Nathaniel went to check the door latch, he saw her sitting near the fire, turning a small silver ring over in her palm, the one wrapped in cloth, now polished from wear. He didn't speak. He only watched as she held it to the light, her eyes reflecting both the glow of the fire and something colder, older, buried deep inside. He thought of saying something, a question, maybe a kindness, but no words seemed right. Instead, he set another log on the fire and stepped out onto the porch. The night was still, the snow crisp under his boots. He could see the faint trail of footprints that led from the cabin to the shed and back again, fading into frost. Bramble stirred inside the stable, snorting softly, its breath a pale ghost in the dark. Nathaniel stood there a while, watching the stars break through thin clouds. He felt the cold in his bones, but he didn't go in just yet. Some silences were worth sharing with the night. Down in town, 20 miles below, life carried on as if storms were nothing new. Inside the dusty warmth of Fletcher's general store, a group of men gathered by the stove, boots dripping meltwater onto the floor. Among them was Earl Maddox, a ranch hand in his 30s, tall, with a crooked grin and a reputation for knowing everyone's business but his own. He leaned against the counter, voice low but eager, feeding on the attention of the others. "They say the widow from Kansas ain't alone up there no more," he said, smirking. "Took shelter with that mountain ghost, Briggs. Guess he found himself company after all." Laughter rippled through the room. Quick, mean, the kind that fills small places. Old Man Fletcher looked up from his ledger, frowning. "That ridge is no place for gossip," he muttered. But no one listened. The rumor had already taken flight, light as dust and just as impossible to catch. By the next morning, it had spread down the road to the post office, through the saloon, into the sheriff's ears, and finally to the stagecoach driver who carried tales faster than mail. By the time the words climbed back up the ridge, they had grown teeth. Nathaniel knew nothing of it yet. He woke early, as he always did, to the sound of fire settling and Bramble pawing at the frozen ground outside. He stepped onto the porch, rubbing his hands together against the cold. The air was sharp, the light thin and clear. The world felt clean again, scrubbed by the storm. He reached for the kettle left out to catch snowmelt, and then froze. On the porch rail, half buried in frost, lay a brass bullet casing. Its edge gleamed faintly in the dawn light. He picked it up, turning it between his fingers. It was new, not rusted, not weathered. Fresh. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. The mountain was quiet again, too quiet. The kind of stillness that came before trouble. He looked out toward the line of trees, their branches unmoving, their shadows long across the snow. Somewhere down the valley, a crow called once, sharp and solitary. He slipped the casing into his pocket, eyes still on the woods, the firelight from inside flickering softly behind him. And for the first time since the storm, the mountain didn't feel like it was his alone. The morning after, the frost had hardened the snow into glass. Every step cracked like breaking bone beneath Nathaniel's boots as he saddled Bramble. The Mustang's breath plumed in the thin light, tail flicking against the cold. Down in the valley, smoke rose from the clustered chimneys of town, and a faint hum of voices drifted up the trail. Nathaniel needed only salt and coffee, but something in his chest told him it would not be a quiet ride. He rode through the frozen forest in silence, the hooves thudding against packed snow, the reins creaking softly in his gloved hands. The wind had no edge that morning, only a kind of listening stillness. When he reached the outskirts of town, the world shifted. Sound returned, distant laughter, the bark of a dog, the rattle of a wagon. The air smelled of smoke, leather, and gossip. He tied Bramble outside the general store and stepped inside, shoulders brushing the cold off his coat. The bell over the door rang once. Every head turned. The room was dim, thick with pipe smoke and the stale heat of too many bodies. Behind the counter, Earl Maddox leaned back on a crate of beans, grinning like a man who enjoyed being heard. His coat was open despite the cold, his hair slicked back with grease, and his eyes followed Nathaniel with open amusement. The merchant, Mr. Fletcher, gave a small nod, wary but polite. Nathaniel tipped his hat in return. He picked up a sack of salt and a tin of coffee without looking at anyone, but the laughter started low. Two men near the stove, one spitting tobacco into a pail, the other whispering something too soft to catch. Then came the sound of a snicker, a snort, the kind that builds like a storm behind closed doors. Earl's voice cut through the air, smooth and sharp. "Didn't think we'd see you down from your mountain, Briggs. Guess it's true what they're saying. The widow from Kansas keeping you warm these days?" Nathaniel set the coffee down, slow, deliberate. His face didn't move, but his eyes found Earl's. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. The stove popped, breaking the stillness. Then Nathaniel straightened to his full height and said it plain. "She works for me. She's under my roof. You want trouble, bring it to me." The words landed like stones. No one spoke. Even Earl's grin faltered, the swagger draining from his voice. Fletcher cleared his throat, muttered something about minding business, and handed over the wrapped goods. Nathaniel took them without another word, left the coins on the counter, and stepped back into the cold. Outside, the town seemed smaller. He untied Bramble, gave the horse's neck a firm pat, and mounted up. The reins creaked again, but this time it sounded different, stronger, more certain. Behind him, the men in the store said nothing. Only the bell rang as the door swung shut, and then the sound was swallowed by snow. The ride home was long and quiet. The wind had picked up again, swirling flurries across the trail like scattered ash. The mountain loomed above, pale and waiting. Nathaniel's jaw was set hard beneath the brim of his hat. He wasn't sure if he was angry or tired, maybe both. The world below could talk itself hoarse. The mountain, at least, stayed silent. By the time he reached the cabin, twilight had already crept into the trees. Smoke from the chimney met the dusk halfway, curling into soft violet air. When he opened the door, Anna was standing by the table, her shawl drawn tight around her shoulders. She looked at him the way someone looks at thunder, expecting the flash before the noise. "You didn't have to defend me," she said quietly. "I did," he answered. Her gaze lingered on him for a long moment, then dropped. Something passed between them, an understanding too delicate to name. She turned back to the stove, stirring the pot, and he hung his coat by the fire without another word. After that night, things shifted in ways neither could explain. Nathaniel began to light her fire early each morning, so the room was warm before she rose. He'd place her boots by the stove, polished of frost, the leather soft from care. In return, she left a lantern burning when he rode out, its glow spilling onto the porch like a promise. Two silences, once cold, once cautious, had begun to speak to each other in gestures too small for words. Days passed, and the sky grew heavy again. The air thickened with the scent of snow, that iron tang that warned of something coming. Even Bramble stamped nervously in the shed, ears twitching to the wind. Nathaniel checked the latch on every shutter, stacked wood by the door, and watched the ridgeline vanish behind clouds. When the storm came, it didn't announce itself. It descended. 1 hour the world was still. The next, it was gone. The wind roared through the chimney, and snow hammered against the windows until the cabin shook. Outside, the world turned white and soundless. Nathaniel moved through it like a man in a dream, stoking the fire, securing the horses, his breath fogging in the dim light. Near midnight, a sound rose above the storm, a gasp, sharp and human, He turned, heart thudding. Anna was gripping the edge of the table, her knuckles white, her face pale as the snow beyond the glass. "It's time," she breathed, her voice breaking. For a moment, Nathaniel froze. Then instinct took over. He cleared the table, pushed aside the bowls and lamp, and snatched the old book from the shelf, the one with the cracked spine, the Prairie Woman's Guide to Birth. His hands trembled as he flipped to the marked page. The lantern light flickered wildly, throwing long shadows across the walls. "Just breathe," he said, though his own voice was shaking. He boiled water, tore clean strips of cloth, fumbled with the instructions that blurred before his eyes. Anna's cries came soft but steady, muffled by the storm outside. The wind howled through the cracks, like the mountain itself was bearing witness. Minutes stretched into hours. The fire dimmed. Nathaniel's palms were slick with sweat, though the air was freezing. And then, silence. He looked down, the world narrowing to the still shape in his hands. The child was small, impossibly still. No cry, no breath. Anna's head fell back, her lips moving without sound. Nathaniel felt the blood drain from his face. The storm pounded at the walls, demanding entry, as he bent over the child, trembling. His voice cracked on a whisper, a prayer he hadn't said in 20 years. "Please." The lantern guttered, the wind roared, and the world went black. For a long heartbeat, there was nothing. And then, one sharp gasp. The light came slowly, as if even the sun was afraid to disturb what had happened in the night. It spilled through the frost-covered window in soft gold threads, touching the wooden floor, the quiet walls, the weary hands of a man who hadn't slept. The storm had gone, leaving behind a silence too pure to belong to this world. Inside the cabin, the fire still burned, low, steady, alive. And from the cradle of that warmth came a sound small enough to break a heart, a single fragile cry. Nathaniel sat near the stove, his face ghostly in the new light, eyes red from hours of watching, waiting, hoping. In his arms was a bundle wrapped in flannel, breathing softly against his chest. His hands trembled as he reached for a small block of cedar, his knife glinting in the dim light. Slowly, he carved letters into the wood, his breath catching on each curve. When it was done, he blew the dust away and whispered the name aloud, Micah. Anna lay in bed, pale but awake, her hair damp against her temples. Her eyes followed every movement, hollow yet glimmering with something she hadn't dared feel in a long time. When Nathaniel looked up, she tried to smile, but the effort broke her voice instead. "You saved him," she whispered, so faint the words seemed to float rather than fall. Nathaniel shook his head. "Maybe he saved me." For a while, neither spoke. Only the baby's soft breathing filled the space, sinking with the crackle of the fire. Outside, the frost began to melt, and drops of water slid down the window pane like slow tears. The mountain, once cruel and endless, now felt small enough to hold in one's chest. Days passed, one blurring into the next. The snow began to recede from the roof, dripping steadily from the eaves. The rhythm of life changed, quiet, slower, filled with new sounds that had never belonged to this house before. The whimper of a waking child, the soft hum of a lullaby, the sigh of two people learning to speak through care instead of words. Nathaniel found himself humming as he worked, old songs from a time before the war, before the silence took root in him. He didn't remember the lyrics, only the melody, and even that was fractured. But the baby didn't seem to mind. Micah would stare at him with eyes the color of dawn, unblinking, as if trying to memorize the face of the man who had called him back from the edge. Anna began to move again, her steps careful, her body still weak, but her hands steady. She washed the linens, mended Nathaniel's gloves, and whispered to the child in words that sounded like prayers. Once, when Nathaniel walked in from splitting wood, he caught her laughing, just once, quick as a bird's wing, and it stopped him in his tracks. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed that sound. As the snow thinned into patches, the world outside began to breathe again. The pines shook off their burden, rivers of meltwater whispered through the rocks, and bramble pawed at the thawing earth impatiently. One afternoon, Nathaniel took Micah outside, wrapped in a blanket, to feel the air. The child blinked at the brightness, tiny fingers curling toward the sky. Nathaniel smiled, a small, uneven thing that startled even him. But peace in the mountains never lasts long. That same evening, a distant echo of hooves rose from the trail below. Bramble's ears flicked up, and Nathaniel turned toward the sound, his instincts sharpening. The figure appeared between the pines, a man on horseback, riding slow but steady through the slush. As he drew closer, Nathaniel recognized the formal cut of the man's coat, the gleam of brass buttons against dark wool, the seal of the county stitched into the saddlebag. The rider was in his 50s, lean but upright, with a wind-burned face and gray eyes that had seen too much. His name was Mr. Hollis Ward, a government clerk and land assessor, known for his precision, not his kindness. His gloves were spotless despite the mud, his voice crisp as frost when he spoke. "Morning, Mr. Briggs." He dismounted with the stiffness of someone who preferred paperwork to horses. "Fine air today. Shame about the reason I'm here." He glanced at the cabin, then at Anna through the half-open door. "The county received a notice, a concern about your living arrangements." Nathaniel's hand tightened around the saddle rope. "Concern?" Hollis nodded, pulling out a folded document. "It's about her, the woman. Anna Briggs, is it?" "Anna," Nathaniel said simply. "Not your wife, then." Hollis sighed, as if weary of saying what he'd said too many times before. "You see, the law doesn't take kindly to two unmarried folks living under one roof. There's talk, official talk. If she's not your wife, the court will have to move her to the women's home in town." The words hung there, colder than any storm. Anna stood in the doorway, holding Micah close, her expression unreadable, not fear, not anger, just the quiet resignation of someone who'd run out of places to go. Nathaniel said nothing at first. He only looked at her, then at the man before him. The wind picked up again, rattling the branches, carrying the faint creak of the stable door. Finally, he spoke, voice low but firm. "You tell your law it can come up this mountain itself if it means to take her." Hollis frowned. "I'm not here for a fight, Mr. Briggs. I'm here to give you a warning. Paperwork's coming. You've got a few days, maybe a week. After that..." He stopped, looking at the child in Anna's arms. "After that, things'll get harder." He mounted his horse again, pulling his coat tight. "You're a decent man, Nathaniel. But the law doesn't measure decency, only names." Then he turned, and within moments the sound of his hooves faded down the trail. Nathaniel stood there for a long time, the document crumpled in his fist. The evening sun turned the snow to gold, but he didn't see it. He turned back toward the cabin. Anna was still there, eyes locked on him. For the first time, there was no wall between them, just the question that neither dared to ask aloud. Slowly, Nathaniel reached into the pocket of his coat. His hand closed around something smooth, familiar, and cold. When he pulled it out, the fading light caught the edge of silver, a simple ring, old and worn, the words "Grace found" scratched inside. He looked at Anna, and the mountain for a moment went completely still. The snow was gone by the time the creek began to sing again. Its water, once locked beneath ice, now ran bright and restless through the pines, carrying the scent of new earth. The mountain no longer looked like a place of endurance. It breathed. The cabin, too, had changed. Smoke rose from its chimney not as a signal of survival, but as a quiet rhythm of living. Inside, sunlight spilled across the table, warming the air that once belonged only to ghosts. Nathaniel stood by the window, sleeves rolled, his hands rough from work but steady as he trimmed a small sprig of wildflowers that had dared to bloom beside the steps. The petals trembled between his fingers, yellow, delicate, stubborn in their will to exist. Behind him, Anna was feeding Micah, the boy's small laughter bright as birdsong. It filled every empty corner of the room. Nathaniel turned at the sound, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the urge to listen for the wind. That afternoon, they rode into town. The air shimmered with the promise of spring, and Bramble's hooves drummed a soft rhythm along the damp trail. The valley spread below them in green and silver, rivers flashing like glass beneath the sun. When they reached the courthouse, the clerk looked up from his papers, surprised to see Nathaniel Briggs, the man known for avoiding crowds, standing tall beside a woman with eyes full of quiet resolve. Mr. Hollis Ward, the same government official who had once come with warning, stood as their witness. His expression softened now, the edges of formality worn down by time. He adjusted his spectacles and cleared his throat. "So, you're making it right then," he said, not unkindly. Nathaniel gave a short nod. There were no flowers, no guests, no choir, only the sound of a pen scratching, the faint hum of a fly on the windowsill, and the scent of rain drifting in through the door. Nathaniel reached into his coat pocket, his fingers closing around the silver ring he had carried for months. He slid it onto her finger with the same care he'd give a fragile piece of woodwork, deliberate and sure. No vows, no speeches, just the truth. Quiet, steady, and real. Anna looked down at the ring, her lips parting slightly, the reflection of sunlight glinting off the engraved words. Grace found. Her eyes lifted to meet his, and for a moment, there was no sound but the breathing of two people who had finally stopped running. Hollis signed the paper, stamped it, and muttered, "Well, that's that." Nathaniel exhaled, not relief, but something deeper, a peace that felt earned. As they stepped back into the sunlight, Anna slipped her hand into his. The warmth between their palms was small, but it felt like the whole world. Months turned into seasons, and the seasons became a year. The mountain dressed itself in green again, wildflowers scattering across the slopes, and the sound of Micah's laughter became the mountain's new song. The garden behind the cabin grew thick with beans and herbs, half tamed by Anna's hands. She often scolded the weeds for being too bold, yet never pulled them all, as if even chaos deserved a place to live. Nathaniel built her a chair that spring, solid oak, smoothed with hours of care. His knife traced the grain as though following a heartbeat. On the backrest, he carved words that came to him without thought, simple and exact. Home wasn't a place. It was the way you said my name. He set it by the porch where she liked to sit, facing the valley. When she found it, she ran her hand along the carving, fingers trembling slightly, then looked back at him with a smile that spoke more than gratitude. It spoke of arrival. Micah, now toddling with the clumsy confidence of the newly brave, crawled through the garden chasing patches of sunlight. Bramble watched nearby, older now, his white breath soft in the evening air, his eyes gentle and calm as if guarding them out of habit. Anna's laughter carried across the yard, and Nathaniel thought he'd never heard anything so close to Grace. As twilight fell, the sky turned the color of lavender and gold, the last light of day caught in the cabin's windows. The three of them sat together on the porch, the rocking chair creaking in its slow, tender rhythm. Micah lay asleep across Anna's lap, one hand gripping the edge of her shawl. Anna looked out toward the horizon, her voice barely above a whisper. "I came here to cook," she said, almost smiling. Nathaniel chuckled softly. "And you ended up teaching me Grace." She turned toward him then, her eyes glistening in the dusk. "You already had it," she said. "You just forgot what it looked like." He reached over, brushing a strand of hair from her face. The fire inside flickered through the doorway, painting their silhouettes in amber and shadow. For a while, neither of them spoke. The air smelled of wood smoke, fresh earth, and the promise of rain. The mountain, once cruel and unyielding, seemed to lean closer, listening, its wind no longer howling, but whispering softly, like a hymn. Above them, the stars began to bloom, one by one, across the quiet sky. And in that stillness, where love had taken root in the soil of loss, the cabin at last became what it was always meant to be. Not a shelter from storms, but a place where storms no longer needed to be feared. The camera would have panned wide if anyone had been there to see. The cabin breathing smoke into the calm air, the baby's soft giggle breaking through dreams, the rhythm of the chair creaking under the weight of peace. The wind passed gently through the pines, carrying no sorrow, no cry, only the sound of life continuing. The mountain, once a witness to their solitude, now kept their secret. And the world, at long last, was quiet again. Sometimes, the greatest stories don't come with thunder or grand miracles. They happen quietly, in the warmth of a hand reaching out, in the courage it takes to open a door, or in the mercy we choose to give when no one is watching. Grace beneath the snow reminds us that love isn't always loud or burning. Sometimes, it's the soft ember that never goes out, the kind that turns loneliness into belonging and sorrow into song. If you listen closely, you might hear that same grace somewhere in your own life, in the people who stayed, in the kindness that found you when the world felt cold. And maybe that's all the miracle we ever needed. Tell me where you're watching from tonight, and if this story touched your heart. Don't forget to subscribe, so you won't miss the next light that still flickers, even in the darkest storms. Until then, stay warm, stay kind, and let grace find its way to you